I felt a strange pang of discomfort the first time Andrew mentioned that his childhood friend, Rachel, had moved back to town. We were sitting at the dinner table, and he casually dropped it into the conversation like it was just another detail about his day. "Did I tell you Rachel moved back?" he said, his eyes flicking up from his plate to gauge my reaction. I knew who he was talking about, of course. Rachel had been one of those names from his past, a friend he occasionally mentioned in passing. They had gone to high school together, spent summers hanging out by the lake, and from the way he described it, they'd been inseparable until college came and life took them down different paths. I didn't think much of it at first. She was, after all, just a friend from his past. "Oh, really? That's nice," I replied, keeping my tone light. But somewhere deep inside I could feel the smallest thread of unease, though I didn't fully understand why. The first time he went to meet her for coffee, he looked almost excited. I told myself it was just nostalgia. They hadn't seen each other in years, so of course he'd be thrilled to reconnect. I kissed him goodbye and told him to have a good time, but as he walked out the door, a strange sense of emptiness crept into the room, filling the space he just left. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overthinking. After all, they were just friends. They'd been kids together, and I was sure that kind of bond was innocent and pure. But when he came back that evening, there was something different in his smile, a lightness, as if he'd returned to some part of himself that I'd never known. "How was it?" I asked, hoping my curiosity sounded casual. "It was really nice. We talked for hours. It was like no time had passed at all," he said, his eyes almost glowing with a fondness that tugged at my chest. Days turned into weeks, and their catch-up sessions became regular. Once a week became twice, then 3 times. Sometimes he'd mention her in passing, how they laughed about old memories, how they shared the same sense of humor, how good it felt to be around someone who knew him so well back then. He didn't seem to notice the small flickers of tension in my eyes when he talked about her, and I didn't have the courage to bring it up. I was afraid he'd think I was overreacting. But each time he left to meet her, the empty space in our house seemed to grow, filling with unspoken questions. My mind began to spin with thoughts I couldn't control, each one sharpening the edges of my insecurity. What did she look like now? Had she changed? Did she have the same easy laugh he seemed to love so much? I tried to push those thoughts away, to remind myself that it was all in my head. They were just old friends. One evening, he came home later than usual, his cheeks flushed and a slight glow in his eyes. "Sorry, we just lost track of time," he said with a casual shrug, as if nothing was wrong. But I couldn't help but wonder, was I really just imagining it? Or was there something there, something lingering between them, even if they wouldn't admit it? One night I finally worked up the courage to ask. I kept my tone as even as I could, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "Andrew, do you think, you see her so often now. It's almost like..." I trailed off, unsure how to phrase it without sounding accusatory. He looked at me, taken aback. "What? Are you jealous?" he asked with a laugh, as if the idea was ridiculous. But the way he brushed it off so easily only fueled the flames inside me. I felt small, foolish, but most of all, I felt like something precious was slipping through my fingers. Was I crazy? Was I reading too much into this? Or was there really something I needed to worry about? The worst part was I couldn't even tell anyone. How could I admit to my friends or family that I was feeling threatened by my husband's childhood friend? It sounded pathetic, so I bottled it up, pretending that everything was fine. The next weekend, Andrew invited me to join them. He probably thought it would reassure me, but instead I felt like an outsider, standing in the background while they exchanged stories, laughing over old jokes that I wasn't a part of. Rachel was charming, warm, and though I hated to admit it, beautiful. She was exactly the kind of woman who would have intimidated me even if she hadn't had a history with my husband. She looked at him with a softness in her eyes that I recognized all too well. It was how I used to look at him. The weeks dragged on, and I felt myself slipping further and further away. I could tell that Andrew sensed it too, but every time he asked if something was wrong, I forced a smile, pretending it was all okay. I didn't want to be the insecure wife, clinging to her husband out of fear. But one night I couldn't hold it in anymore. He came home late, smelling faintly of her perfume, and something inside me snapped. "Andrew, do you even realize how this looks? How it feels?" The words spilled out, raw and unfiltered. He looked genuinely shocked, his eyes widening. "You don't trust me?" he asked, sounding hurt. "She's just a friend, someone I grew up with. You're my wife, and nothing is going to change that." But his words did little to soothe the ache in my heart. For him it was so simple. For me it was an endless cycle of questions and doubts, of wondering if I'd already lost him to a past I couldn't compete with. The tension lingered between us, unspoken yet ever present, casting a shadow over every smile, every touch. And in the quiet moments when he was gone and I was alone, I couldn't help but wonder, where did friendship end and something more begin? I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying our conversation over and over. Andrew's words, "She's just a friend, someone I grew up with," looped in my head, tangled in the knot of my doubts and fears. I wanted to believe him, I wanted to feel secure in the bond we'd built over the years. But my heart kept lurching every time I thought of them together, laughing over shared memories I wasn't part of, memories that had no place for me. The next day I made a decision. I needed to talk to someone to find clarity. I called Sarah, my closest friend, someone who'd known me since college. When we met for coffee, I could hardly get the words out. It felt silly, like I was overreacting, like I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But as I spilled the story, the feelings came tumbling out, raw and unfiltered. Sarah listened patiently, her expression softening as she sipped her coffee. "You're not crazy," she finally said, placing her hand over mine. "I think anyone in your position would feel the same way. It's natural to feel threatened when someone from his past suddenly takes up so much space in his present. But maybe he really does see her as just a friend." I nodded, trying to absorb her words, but the comfort was short-lived. Later that night, when Andrew texted me to say he'd be home late after another dinner with Rachel, the knot tightened in my stomach again. I could feel my grip on my own emotions slipping, like sand running through my fingers. One weekend, Rachel invited us both over for a small gathering at her place. She'd recently bought a house on the edge of town, and Andrew was buzzing with excitement about seeing it. I forced a smile and agreed to go, even though every fiber of my being wanted to stay home, to ignore this woman who had unknowingly shaken the foundation of my marriage. Her house was beautiful, tastefully decorated, cozy but modern. It was everything she was. Effortlessly put together, charming, welcoming. As I stood there in her kitchen, sipping wine and watching her joke with Andrew, I felt like an intruder in my own life. She seemed so comfortable around him, so at ease in his presence, and he looked the same. It was as if they were in their own little world, a bubble of shared memories and history that I couldn't penetrate. At one point in the evening, I found myself alone with Rachel. She smiled warmly at me, her eyes shining with friendliness, but there was something in her gaze that I couldn't quite read. Maybe I was imagining it, but her look felt almost knowing, like she understood exactly how I felt but didn't see it as a problem. "I'm so glad we finally got to do this," she said, her voice smooth and soft. "It's been amazing reconnecting with Andrew. I hope it doesn't bother you that we spend so much time together." The question caught me off guard. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "No, of course not," I said, my voice sounding thin and distant even to my own ears. "You two go way back." "I get it." She nodded, still smiling, but there was something in her expression. Something just a little too smug, too self-assured. It sent a chill down my spine. After that night, I became more vigilant. I'd always trusted Andrew, had always believed we were open and honest with each other. But now I found myself questioning every little thing. If he glanced at his phone and smiled, I'd wonder if it was a message from her. If he was a few minutes late coming home, I'd imagine them laughing together, sharing secrets that didn't include me. One evening I confronted him. "Andrew," I said, my voice wavering despite my efforts to sound calm, "do you ever think about what it would have been like if you and Rachel had, ended up together?" He looked at me surprised. "What? No, that's ridiculous. She's just a friend. That's all she's ever been. But do you ever think about it?" I pressed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "You spend so much time with her. You two share all these memories, this whole world that I'm not a part of. Sometimes I feel like I'm the one intruding on your story." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're not intruding, okay? I love you. You're my wife. Rachel is she's just someone who knows a different part of me, that's all." You don't need to feel threatened by her. I wanted to believe him, but his words felt hollow like a script he'd rehearsed to keep me at bay. And the more he insisted, the more convinced I became that there was something he wasn't telling me. The final straw came one Saturday afternoon. He'd planned to go hiking with Rachel, something they used to do together as teenagers. I asked if I could join, but he gently brushed it off, saying it was something special they did back then, a tradition of sorts. I tried to hide my disappointment, but as he left that morning, I felt a surge of anger and betrayal rise within me. I didn't want to sit idly by anymore, waiting for my husband to come home and reassure me with half-hearted words. So, on impulse, I decided to drive up to the trail where they'd gone hiking. I knew the place well. We'd been there before ourselves. When I arrived, I parked a little way off and started walking along the path, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't be there, knew that this was crossing a line, but I felt desperate, like I had no other choice. After about 20 minutes, I heard voices coming from a clearing up ahead. I stopped, hiding behind a tree as I strained to hear. Their laughter drifted through the trees, soft and intimate, and it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I inched closer just enough to see them. They were sitting on a fallen log, close together, talking in low voices. Andrew's hand rested on her shoulder as they laughed about something, and the look in his eyes was one I hadn't seen in months. It was the way he used to look at me back when we were newly in love. I turned and left before they could see me, my heart shattering with every step. By the time I reached my car, tears were streaming down my face. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't keep lying to myself, hoping that everything was fine, that I was just imagining things. When Andrew came home that evening, I didn't confront him. Instead, I sat quietly watching him, searching for any trace of guilt or remorse. But he looked happy, relaxed, as if he'd just had the best day of his life, and that hurt more than anything. Over the next few weeks, I withdrew. I stopped asking where he was going, stopped trying to compete with memories I couldn't erase. A part of me began to shut down, numbing myself to the pain, preparing for the inevitable. One night, as he lay beside me, I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper. "Andrew, if there's anything you need to tell me, anything at all."
"I'm listening."
He looked at me confused. "What do you mean?" I swallowed, feeling the tears welling up again. "If you love her, if you've fallen out of love with me, please just be honest. I'd rather know than keep feeling like this." His face softened, and for a moment I thought he might actually say it, that he might finally admit to what I'd been suspecting all along. But instead he reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I love you," he said, his voice steady, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. She's just a friend. That's all." But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing him, that he was already halfway gone, lost to a past that would always be a part of him, but one I could never touch. And no matter how many times he told me he loved me, the ache in my chest wouldn't go away. The days after that conversation felt like a slow motion fall into darkness. I wanted so badly to believe him, to trust the man I'd built my life with. But each time he left to catch up with Rachel, the small seed of doubt inside me grew. My every instinct told me that something was off, that his words were meant to comfort me without actually resolving anything. One evening, after yet another coffee date with her, he came home later than expected. I was sitting at the dining room table, the dim light casting long shadows across the room, and I could feel the tension buzzing beneath my skin. He walked in with a smile that faltered when he saw me. "You're still up?" he asked, looking surprised. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." He hesitated, then sat down across from me. "What's going on? You look upset." I wanted to tell him everything, that his friendship with Rachel was tearing me apart, that I felt like I was slowly disappearing from his life. But instead I forced a brittle smile. "Andrew, can we talk? I mean, really talk." He shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to speak. "It's Rachel," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm trying, I really am. But it's getting to be too much. I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with this." His eyes darkened and I saw a flicker of something. Was it guilt? Irritation? I couldn't tell. "We've been over this, haven't we? She's just a friend, someone I grew up with. I don't understand why this is so hard for you to accept. Maybe because it feels like there's more to it than just friendship, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. The way you talk about her, the way you look at her. It's like she has a part of you that I don't. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. This is all in your head, you know that? Rachel is just someone I'm reconnecting with after years. She doesn't mean anything more than that. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to force him to see what he was doing to me. But I swallowed my anger, letting it sink into the pit of my stomach where it would simmer, unresolved. Fine, I whispered, standing up. If you can't see it, then maybe I'm the one who needs to take a step back. I left him sitting there, the silence between us growing thicker with every unspoken word. Over the next few days I pulled back, creating a distance that I hoped might make him realize what he was risking. But he didn't seem to notice. In fact, he continued to see Rachel, mentioning her casually as if nothing had changed. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. Andrew was out with Rachel yet again and I was home alone, pacing the empty house. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know, to have some kind of proof that I wasn't going crazy. Acting on impulse, I picked up his laptop, hesitating only for a second before opening it. My hand shook as I navigated to his email, feeling both terrified and desperate for answers. And then as I scrolled through his inbox, I saw her name. There were messages from Rachel, emails back and forth about their plans, little jokes they shared. Most of it was harmless, but one email caught my eye. A message from a few weeks ago with the subject line, "Thank you for today." My heart hammered as I clicked on it. Andrew, the message read. Thank you for today. I didn't realize how much I missed having you in my life, how much it feels like home being with you again. I don't want to make things complicated, but, well, you know, let's talk soon. Rachel. I read the message over and over, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. Feels like home. Her words echoed in my mind, cutting deeper than any knife. She was saying everything I'd feared, hinting at feelings that went far beyond friendship. And Andrew hadn't stopped her. He hadn't told her to back off, hadn't defended our marriage. Instead, he kept seeing her, letting their connection deepen. When he came home that evening, I was waiting for him, the email open on his laptop in front of me. He stopped short when he saw me, his face pale. What are you doing?" he stammered, his eyes darting from me to the screen. I didn't answer. I simply pushed the laptop toward him, watching as he read the message. His face went through a range of emotions: surprise, guilt, and finally resignation. "I can explain," he began, but I shook my head, cutting him off. "Don't. I don't want explanations, Andrew. I just want the truth. Are you in love with her?" The silence that followed was excruciating. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," he said, the words hanging heavy in the air. It was as if the ground had opened up beneath me. I'd expected denials, promises, even lies, anything but this. His hesitation, his uncertainty was worse than anything I could have imagined. Because in that moment I knew that he wasn't fully mine anymore. That a part of him was already gone. Lost to a past he couldn't let go of. "Then maybe," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face, "you need to figure out what you really want. Because I can't keep living like this, Andrew. I can't keep feeling like I'm the third wheel in my own marriage." He looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I never meant to hurt you. I never thought it would get this far." "But it has," I replied, choking back a sob. "And now we have to decide if there's anything left worth saving." That night, he slept in the guest room. I lay awake, staring at the empty space beside me, feeling the weight of everything we'd built together slowly crumbling. The next few days passed in a haze. Andrew stayed in the guest room and we barely spoke. The house felt hollow, like the echoes of a life that had once been vibrant and full of love. One morning, he came into the kitchen, looking exhausted and defeated. "I need some time," he said quietly, "to figure things out." I nodded, feeling numb. "Take as much time as you need." He packed a bag that evening and left without another word. As the door closed behind him, I felt a strange mix of relief and devastation. I was finally free from the constant worry, the agonizing jealousy. But I was also alone, left to face the wreckage of a marriage I once thought was unbreakable. Days turned into weeks, and the silence of the house became both comforting and suffocating. I threw myself into work, into seeing friends, trying to rebuild the pieces of my life that had been shattered. Sarah came over often, helping me sort through my emotions, offering words of comfort and encouragement. One evening, as I was clearing out the last of Andrew's things from our bedroom, I found an old photo of us, taken on our first anniversary. We were smiling, our faces full of joy and hope for the future. Looking at that photo, I felt a surge of grief for the life we'd lost, for the love that had slipped through our fingers. Then one day Andrew called. His voice was quiet, hesitant, as he asked if we could meet. I agreed, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. When we sat down at the little cafe where we'd shared so many memories, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in months, a look of regret, of longing. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice breaking, "and I realized that I let my past cloud my present, that I let my nostalgia for something that never really existed hurt the person I love the most." I listened, my heart aching with every word. He told me about the pull he'd felt, the allure of something familiar and comfortable. But he also told me that he'd come to understand that Rachel was part of his past, not his future. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, reaching for my hand, his eyes filled with remorse. "But I want to come home. I want to fix this, to try to rebuild what I've broken." I sat there, my mind racing with 1,000 conflicting emotions. I wanted to believe him, to trust in the love we'd once shared. But I also knew that things would never be the same, that the trust between us had been irrevocably damaged. Finally I spoke, my voice trembling. "If we do this, Andrew, it has to be all or nothing. I can't live with half-truths, with lingering doubts. You have to be fully committed to us, to letting go of anything that holds you back." He nodded, his grip tightening on my hand. "I promise. I'll do whatever it takes." And so we began the slow, painful process of rebuilding, of learning to trust each other again. It wasn't easy. Some days the hurt and resentment bubbled up, threatening to tear us apart all over again. But there were also moments of tenderness, of laughter, of small tentative steps toward healing. In time, I came to understand that our love wasn't the same as it had been before, but perhaps it was stronger for having been tested. We had weathered the storm, had faced the ghosts of the past and come out the other side, scarred but still standing. And as I looked at him, at the man who had hurt me and yet fought to win back my heart, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we were both finally ready to let go of the past and start anew. The months that followed were filled with delicate, unsteady steps forward. Every day felt like an exercise in patience and vulnerability, as if we were learning to walk again on unsteady ground. Andrew moved back in, and we tried to re-establish some sense of normalcy, though both of us knew the foundation of our marriage had been irreversibly shaken. The comforting routines that once felt so automatic now felt fragile, as if one wrong word or glance could bring everything crashing down. Andrew was gentle, almost overly careful, as if he was constantly walking on eggshells around me. At first, I resented it. I didn't want to feel like a wounded animal in need of handling with care. But as the days passed, I saw that he was doing his best, trying to respect the boundaries I had put in place. He would check in more often, sharing details about his day, about who he spoke to or where he was going. It felt both reassuring and sad. A reminder of how things used to be, when I didn't need those reassurances because trust had been implicit. Our first real test came when he mentioned that Rachel had reached out. They hadn't spoken since the day he moved out, and I knew the silence between them had likely felt strange for him. Rachel had been an almost constant presence for those months, and I could sense that he felt a mix of loyalty and guilt when it came to her. But as he sat across from me, telling me about her message, he looked different, earnest, and for the first time truly vulnerable. "She wanted to know if we could talk," he said softly, his fingers fidgeting nervously. To clear the air, I guess. But only if you're okay with it." I could feel my heart pounding, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. This was part of rebuilding. I couldn't control him, couldn't monitor his every move. And yet, the thought of him seeing her again, even in an innocent setting, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. It was hard to know if I would ever truly feel okay with him having any kind of connection to her. "Do you think it's a good idea?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was careful not to make it sound accusatory. I didn't want him to feel like I was issuing some kind of ultimatum. Andrew hesitated, considering my question seriously. I don't know, he admitted. I think part of me feels like I owe her an explanation. But I also don't want to hurt you. The honesty in his voice was like a balm to my wounds. It was the first time he had truly acknowledged the tightrope he was walking, the balancing act between his past and our present. Slowly I nodded, swallowing back the sting of tears. If it's something you need to do to move on, then I understand. But I just want to be sure that after this, we're really done with the past. He reached across the table, taking my hand, his gaze steady. I promise. This is about closure. I don't want anything lingering between us. Nothing that could pull us apart again. And so the next week he went to meet Rachel. And I spent the day pacing the house, my stomach in knots, imagining every possible scenario. Would she beg him to stay in her life? Would he suddenly realize he'd made the wrong choice? My mind raced, filling in the silence with my own fears. I tried to distract myself, but nothing could shake the anxiety until he finally came home. The look on his face when he walked in told me everything I needed to know. He looked exhausted, emotionally drained, as if the weight of their shared history had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He came over to me and pulled me into a tight hug, his voice barely a whisper against my hair. It's over, he said, his voice trembling with relief. I told her that I'm choosing you, that I can't keep looking back. We stood there in silence, holding each other as the reality of his words settled over us. I felt an enormous weight lift from my chest, replaced by a cautious hope. He had chosen me, really truly chosen me. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of trust flicker back to life, like a fragile flame waiting to be nurtured. Over the next few months we fell into a new rhythm, one defined by openness and small acts of rebuilding. Andrew began taking me on dates again, as if we were back in the early stages of our relationship, getting to know each other all over again. He would surprise me with little gestures, a handwritten note left on the kitchen counter, a bouquet of flowers on my desk, a quiet dinner at a restaurant I'd always wanted to try but never mentioned. Each gesture felt like a small piece of our fractured foundation being put back in place. We also started therapy, something I had initially resisted. Part of me had thought that if we needed a third party to mediate our conversations, it meant our love wasn't strong enough to survive on its own. But as the sessions went on, I realized how much I'd underestimated the depth of my own hurt. The therapist helped me articulate feelings I hadn't even acknowledged, how much I felt betrayed, not just by the threat of infidelity, but by the way he had allowed me to doubt my own worth. Andrew listened intently, his gaze never wavering as I laid bare the pain I had kept hidden. He shared his own feelings of guilt and confusion, admitting that he had been drawn to Rachel because she represented a simpler, more carefree time in his life, a time when things hadn't been so complicated, when responsibilities and expectations hadn't weighed him down. But he also confessed that being with her, even as a friend, had made him realize just how much he valued what we had built together, how much he would lose if he let me go. For the first time I felt like we were truly seeing each other, flaws and all. The therapy sessions became a sanctuary, a place where we could let down our defenses and confront the wounds that had festered between us. And slowly those wounds began to heal. The turning point came one evening as we were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. We'd fallen into a comfortable silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, when Andrew reached for my hand. I know I can't erase what happened, he said quietly, his thumb gently tracing circles on the back of my hand. But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm all in with everything I am. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope you'll let me keep earning back your trust. I looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the raw vulnerability that hadn't been there before. And in that moment I realized that I had a choice. I could hold on to the pain, letting it keep us both prisoners, or I could let it go and allow us to start fresh. Taking a deep breath, I squeezed his hand, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. I'm ready, I whispered. I'm ready to move forward with you. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept soundly wrapped in his arms, feeling a sense of safety and belonging that I thought I had lost. The months that followed were filled with tentative steps and quiet moments of healing. It wasn't perfect, we still had moments of tension, times when old insecurities would resurface. But each time we would confront them together, talking openly, refusing to let the shadows of the past seep into our future. In time, I found myself trusting him again, letting down the walls I had built around my heart. And gradually, our love began to transform. It wasn't the same love we'd had before, the naive, untested love of newlyweds. It was deeper, richer. A love that had been forged in the fires of pain and betrayal, tempered by forgiveness and understanding. One night, as we lay in bed, I looked over at him, marveling at how far we'd come. The man beside me was both familiar and new, someone I had loved fiercely and yet was learning to love all over again. I reached out, brushing a hand through his hair, and he looked at me with that same tender smile that had won my heart all those years ago. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of emotion, "for giving us another chance." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me, a quiet joy that had been absent for so long. "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely audible in the quiet of the room. "For choosing me. For staying." In that moment, I knew that while the scars of our past would always be there, they no longer defined us. We had created something new, something resilient and beautiful. A love that had been tested, yes, but had emerged stronger, forged in fire and bound by a commitment to keep moving forward, no matter what came our way. And as I drifted off to sleep, my heart full and at peace, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together side by side, ready to write the next chapter of our story. A story built not on perfection, but on the unbreakable strength of two souls who had fought, stumbled, and risen again. As the seasons changed and our lives settled into a new rhythm, I found myself reflecting on everything we had been through. There were still moments when the memories of those dark months crept into my mind, unbidden. Sometimes a passing glance, a small gesture, or even a simple phrase would trigger an echo of the old hurt, reminding me of the fragility of trust. But each time that happened, Andrew was there, patient and understanding, willing to talk through it, willing to hold me until the doubts and shadows faded away. Slowly, I found myself letting go of the lingering pain, allowing myself to truly believe that the worst was behind us. We had built a stronger foundation, one that could weather whatever storms might come. I began to trust again, not just him, but the strength of our relationship and the resilience within me. One evening, we were invited to a gathering at a friend's house. It was the kind of casual, intimate dinner party we used to enjoy, and it felt like a perfect way to mark a fresh beginning. I was excited, nervous, and oddly nostalgic, remembering all the good times we'd had before everything had gone wrong. As we entered the cozy, warmly lit living room, I was struck by a sense of belonging. It felt good to be out, to be surrounded by friends, to feel like a part of the world again. Throughout the evening, Andrew stayed by my side, his hand warm in mine, and I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of connection. I watched him laugh and talk, his face open and full of life, and I saw glimpses of the man I'd fallen in love with, a man who had been there all along, waiting to come back to me. At one point, as the evening was winding down, I excused myself to get some fresh air. I stepped out onto the patio, feeling the cool night air brush against my skin, grounding me. I leaned against the railing, looking up at the stars scattered across the inky sky, feeling a strange, serene peace settle over me. A few minutes later, I heard the soft creak of the door behind me, and Andrew joined me, slipping his arm around my waist. We stood in silence, watching the stars together, the quiet between us filled with a sense of unspoken understanding. "Do you remember that night we spent on the beach?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. "Back when we first started dating?" I smiled, remembering that night vividly. We had stayed out on the sand for hours, watching the waves roll in under the moonlight, talking about everything and nothing. It was one of those magical nights that felt like it had been lifted out of a storybook, the kind of memory that I had clung to during our hardest days. "I remember," I said, leaning into him. "I remember thinking that I'd never felt that close to anyone." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant as if he was looking back into that memory. "I want to feel that way again," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I know things will never be exactly the same, but I want us to have that closeness again. I want you to know every single day how much you mean to me." His words washed over me, filling me with a warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time. I reached up, brushing a hand through his hair, feeling the soft strands between my fingers. "I believe you," I said, my voice steady. "I'm ready to keep building that with you. I want that too." In the weeks that followed, I noticed small changes in him that meant the world to me. He made an effort to truly be present, to listen more deeply, to understand not just my words but the feelings behind them. He began to notice little things he had once overlooked. The way I loved to be surprised with my favorite coffee in the morning, the way I hummed softly when I was feeling content, the way I lit up when he remembered details I hadn't expected him to. And I too found myself changing. I began to trust myself more, to rely on my own strength and intuition, to believe that I could handle whatever life threw at us. The doubts and fears that had once consumed me started to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that grew with each passing day. One afternoon, as we were going through some old photo albums, we stumbled upon a picture of us from years ago, taken at the beginning of our relationship. We were both grinning, caught mid-laugh, the joy on our faces so pure and unguarded. I felt a pang of nostalgia but also a sense of pride. We were no longer those young, naive people. We had been tested, had faced trials we never could have imagined, and we had come out the other side stronger, wiser, more committed to each other. Andrew looked at the photo, his expression softening. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he murmured, glancing over at me. I nodded, feeling tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "Yes, we have." In that moment, I realized something that I hadn't been able to see before. The pain and heartache we had gone through hadn't just hurt us. It had transformed us, molding our love into something deeper, more resilient. We were no longer simply two people in love. We were partners, bound by a shared understanding that went beyond words. As the months turned into years, we continued to grow together, our lives intertwining in new and unexpected ways. There were still challenges, of course, no relationship is ever perfect. But we faced each one with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that we had already overcome the hardest of trials. We built new memories together, creating moments that would carry us through any future storms. One autumn evening, as we sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow over the room, I looked over at Andrew, feeling a sense of peace and contentment that I had thought I'd lost forever. He was reading, his face relaxed, his hand resting on mine. The love between us was quiet, steady, the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures or declarations. It was simply there, woven into the fabric of our lives, strong and unwavering. As I drifted off to sleep that night, wrapped in his embrace, I felt a profound gratitude for the journey we had been on. It hadn't been easy, and there were moments when I had doubted if we would make it. But standing on the other side, I knew that every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had been worth it. Because we had come through it together, our love forged in fire, our bond unbreakable. Looking back, I realized that we hadn't just survived. We had created something new, something beautiful. Our love was no longer built on the idealistic dreams of two young lovers. It was rooted in reality, in the knowledge that we could weather any storm, that we could face any challenge and come out stronger. And as I lay there, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine, I knew that our story was just beginning, that we had an entire lifetime ahead of us to keep growing, to keep building, to keep loving together. As the years went on, the wounds from those difficult days faded into gentle scars, reminders of what we had been through but no longer sources of pain. Each scar held a story, a chapter of our lives we had survived together. We grew into a quieter kind of happiness, one that didn't need to be flaunted or reassured. It was the kind of love that had weathered storms, that didn't demand constant attention but rather settled comfortably, like a well-worn coat that warmed us in every season. Andrew and I fell into a new rhythm as the years passed, and our lives became richer in ways I hadn't anticipated. We took up new hobbies together, things we had never even considered before. Gardening became one of our shared passions. At first, it was a simple project, a few herbs on the windowsill, some flowers to brighten up the yard. But as time went on, it became a ritual. Each Saturday morning, we'd head to the nursery to pick out new plants, each choice a tiny, hopeful commitment to the future we were building together. Working side by side in the garden, with the sun warm on our faces and the smell of freshly turned earth around us, I felt a sense of peace I had never thought possible. It was almost symbolic. We were nurturing something together, watching it grow, knowing that it needed patience, care, and a bit of faith to flourish. And with each season, as new flowers bloomed and the small trees we planted grew stronger, I could see our own love reflected in the plants we tended. Every once in a while, a memory from the past would surface, an echo of those painful months. But instead of feeling anger or sadness, I found myself almost grateful. It was a reminder of how far we'd come, of the resilience we had discovered within ourselves. I began to look at Rachel not as a threat or a ghost of our past but as a catalyst, a force that had tested us and revealed the true strength of our bond. It had taken me a long time to reach that understanding, but it was freeing to know that I no longer needed to fear or resent her presence in our story. One evening, as we were preparing dinner together, chopping vegetables and laughing over some silly joke, Andrew paused, looking at me with a softness in his eyes that still made my heart skip a beat. "Do you ever think about how things might have been different?" he asked, his voice quiet. I set down the knife, wiping my hands and looking at him thoughtfully. I knew what he was asking. It wasn't a question of regret but rather an acknowledgement of how our lives had been shaped by the choices we'd made, by the trials we'd faced. I admitted, meeting his gaze. I used to wonder what might have happened if things had gone differently, if we hadn't gone through all that pain. But now I don't think I'd change a thing. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Really?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Because it brought us here. It brought us to this moment, to this life we're building. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." He smiled, his hand reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "You're the strongest person I know," he whispered. "I don't think I've ever told you just how much I admire you, how much I've learned from you." I felt a lump rise in my throat, the weight of his words settling deep within me. It was moments like these that reminded me why I had chosen to stay, why I had fought to rebuild our marriage. I hadn't just stayed out of loyalty or duty. I had stayed because, despite everything, I still believed in us. In time, our love took on new shapes, especially as we began thinking about expanding our family. It wasn't an easy decision. There had been so much healing to do that the thought of bringing a child into our lives had seemed distant, almost impossible at times. But as the years passed, that dream began to feel real again, like a door we could finally open. We talked about it late into the night, sharing our hopes and fears, our excitement and uncertainties. And when we finally made the choice to try for a family, it felt like the ultimate testament to our resilience. We were ready to create something new together, to bring life into the world and show our future child the strength of love, forgiveness, and commitment. The journey wasn't without its challenges. There were difficult moments, disappointments, and times when we wondered if it was meant to be. But through it all, we leaned on each other, drawing strength from the foundation we had rebuilt. And eventually our dream came true. When our daughter was born, I felt a love so profound it brought tears to my eyes. Holding her tiny body in my arms, feeling her soft breaths against my skin, I knew that this was the life we had fought for, the future we had dared to hope for. Andrew stood beside me, his eyes filled with awe and tenderness, and in that moment I saw a glimpse of the man he had become. A man shaped by our shared struggles, our shared triumphs, our shared commitment. Watching him with our daughter, seeing the gentle way he held her, spoke to her, loved her, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. All the pain, the heartache, the sleepless nights, it had all led to this, to the family we were now. Our daughter became the center of our world, a symbol of everything we had built and everything we had overcome. As she grew, we shared our love and wisdom with her, teaching her about kindness, resilience, and the power of forgiveness. I knew that one day, she might ask about our story, about the challenges we'd faced. And I would tell her honestly and openly that love is not always easy, but it is always worth fighting for. As the years continued to pass, our lives filled with laughter, with new memories, with a quiet joy that colored every day. We watched our daughter grow, her laughter filling our home, her curiosity and wonder reminding us of the beauty in even the smallest moments. Looking back, I realized that our journey had been a series of choices to stay, to forgive, to rebuild. We had chosen each other over and over again, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. And in doing so, we had created a love that was not just resilient, but enduring, a love that had been tested by time and trial and had emerged stronger. In the end, I knew that our love was not perfect, but it was real. It was the kind of love that had weathered storms, that had seen us through our darkest moments and lifted us to our brightest ones. And as I held Andrew's hand, feeling the warmth of his touch, I knew that we would continue to choose each other, every day, for the rest of our lives. Our story was not one of fairy tales and flawless romance. It was a story of two flawed, human souls who had stumbled, fallen, and risen again, bound by a love that had been forged in fire and tempered by forgiveness. And as I looked at the life we had created, at the family we had built, I knew that this was all I had ever wanted, all I would ever need.